I have one final question for you, Dr. Marmurek, and for the record, it's Tim Timbrick and Charles Fougere for the Government of Canada. If you go to page 9, the last paragraph there just states that the scope of the present cumulative effects analysis is limited to the scope of the Cohen Commission technical research projects as a whole. Our cumulative effects analysis has been conducted within the universe of the other technical projects and data available from within those projects. This is not a cumulative effects study of Fraser River Sockeye salmon within the broader realm of all available scientific literature, research, and reports. And so my question is, just for clarity, you'll agree that this report does not consider the testimony and cross-examination of the authors of the other technical research projects that appeared before this commissioner?
It doesn't consider the testimony, it does consider their reports.
Yeah, thank you. It's just their reports. Thank you.
Yes.
Those are all my questions, and for the record, I think I've used up 11 minutes of the time that was allotted to me.
Mr. Commissioner, Cliff Prowse for the province of British Columbia. And I have, I think, 25 minutes left, and I think I'll be less than that. I have Canada's documents, tab 1, please. This is an operational policy statement addressing cumulative environmental effects under the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. Have you been involved in any projects that have involved environmental assessments under the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act?
The company as a whole has, and I'm involved which will be, but I haven't had a lot of experience with them.
You've been involved in other kinds of environmental assessments and other jurisdictions? And this is a practitioner's guide, so it's basically telling people what they have to do with respect to cumulative environmental effects if the SIA is triggered, as I understand it. This kind of assessment of environmental effects is not, this would be within, I think, what in the statement you just read was within the broader literature about environmental effects. This isn't the kind of literature that you've considered for purposes of this report.
Well, we did look at how cumulative effects assessment is considered under SIA when we were designing our approach to this retrospective ecological risk assessment. I think a key difference here is that cumulative effects assessment under SIA is looking forward as a project, and then you're looking at what other projects can be reasonably foreseen to also be occurring in the future that might interact with the effects of the project. So that's one difference. The other difference is that the way this operational policy statement works is it's centered on the project as opposed to centered on the valued ecosystem component, which is, in this case, sockeye. So we're looking at all the different factors that can affect sockeye and addressing it from that point of view, which some of my colleagues, like Lauren Gregg, who was on the study, have argued is a better way to actually do cumulative effects assessment.
Are there any conceptual differences, apart from the ones you mentioned, between the approach you've taken and the one that's embodied in this kind of an approach that are important for the Commissioner to know?
I think it's fundamentally different. In the task here is to look retrospectively and say what are all the different factors and how have they interacted to have affected sockeye, as opposed to saying here is one project and how could that project going forward affect a variety of different environmental components, including other possible projects that might occur. So this particular practitioner's guide I don't think is really relevant to what the task that the Cohen Commission had to do.
I'm going to get this muddled up, but there's a saying, I think, if you're approaching your financial planner, that past results aren't a guarantee of future performance. Mm-hmm. How does that concept apply to what you're just saying? Because aren't we in the Commission really concerned with future performance, and that's the only reason why we're interested in the past results?
Well, I think that's a good warning, both financially and biologically, in that the sequence of ocean years which may occur in the future could be quite different from what has occurred in the past. There are many alternative futures, whereas there's only one past. the actual question that all of the main authors of these reports were asked to look at is what's the relative likelihood of these different stressors of having influenced the past. Now, how you best manage fisheries going forward is really a good question. That's not a question that we were addressing, nor is it a question that most of the other reports were addressing, with the exception of the ones that were looking at fisheries management.
Mr. Commissioner, for the record, could we mark this as the next exhibit, please? Going forward, in your report, you were asked to look at research projects going forward.
Mm-hmm.
So in this report, you've selected recommendations broken down by life stage, and then you bolded 12 of them. Is there, and you've also, I guess the first question is, you've talked about, I think, having an integrated approach to all this so that you're doing research on everything. Maybe I've misstated that. Can you explain how you would select going forward the research areas that you've honed in on here?
So, first of all, it's not up to me to make that decision, and in the testimony that I gave earlier to the commission lawyer, I outlined on the previous page, Mr. Lyon, if we go to 107, what I think the criteria would be for further prioritizing this list. So those 4 questions that you see up there on page 107 represent the process that we would recommend using and the process that we've used in other projects for trying to prioritize.
All right, and you referred to the some EPA data quality objectives processes, which I take it you've utilized in other projects?
Yes, going back to the 1980s in acid rain and many other applications since then.
Does the EPA have an overarching integrated scheme for their projects, or is this something, is this really a tool you use on specific projects within the EPA realm?
This is more used within specific projects within the Environmental Protection Agency. That was how it was originally designed. So if you wanted to, for example, decide if a river were polluted or not, that you would lay out what your decision criteria were for making that decision, what all the inputs were, and then design a study accordingly to fit that. That having been said, we found it applies quite well to broader situations where you have multiple potential research and monitoring projects that you might do. And by asking the question, what are the decisions you really want to make and what are the inputs to those decisions, certain things rise to the top as being more important than others.
In this, I guess within the world of the Cohen inquiry, then the participants can make recommendations about how this approach would be applied, and the commissioner may choose to adopt this system or some other system, or adopt these recommendations, and those would all be made as a recommendation to the Government of Canada in this instance. Have you considered or written about different options for decision making as to who would make these overall arching decisions? For example, there's some people refer to a fisheries research board that I think is a past entity that had some coordinating function. But have you written on that topic as to how do you decide who should make that decision?
No, I haven't written specifically on that topic. What I found in other projects with similar challenges is that the best way to make those decisions is to have a good dialogue between the managers who need the information and the scientists who produce it, so that the managers keep the scientists relevant to their real decision needs, and the scientists keep the managers realistic with respect to what can or cannot be answered by science. So I really believe that it's a mix of the two that's required.
I'm going to digress from this point, simply to ask, the subject of contaminants has come up in the hearing, and this morning you told Ms. Baker a few times that your comments where you've written about contaminants is based on known contaminants as opposed to the unknown or emerging contaminants and endocrine disruptors, where simply they're not known, so you haven't considered them in your report. Is that a fair statement?
That's a fair statement.
I understand from your resume that you were involved with pulp mill standards going back 20 years ago or so, 15 or 20 years ago, is that right?
We weren't involved in developing standards. We worked with Environment Canada and BC Ministry of Environment on looking at the fate and effects of pulp mill effluents in the Fraser Basin. It was more attempting to decide what were research and monitoring priorities. And some modeling was involved with professors from Simon Fraser University.
So you may or may not have a view on this, but my question is, how do we understand the evidence we've had in this inquiry from Mr. MacDonald and others about that it should be an important research project to look at endocrine disruptors and contaminants of emerging concern, as opposed to looking backwards to the studies that you would have been involved in at that time, or the governments were involved at that time, about pulp mills, which I think largely succeeded in cleaning up the matters that were the matter of concern. Is this just a generational iterative process that in the future it's always good to do an update and look at these things, or how would you explain that?
Well, I think new stressors emerge, and it's a good idea to do some studies to assess, is this a big problem or a small problem? I don't think it should be that hard to collect some smolts at the outlet of the Fraser and analyze them for contaminant burdens and get better estimates of exposure, and then do a kind of screening assessment on how large or small a problem is. One thing I'll note in context here, when it comes back to the comments I made earlier to Ms. Baker about the pattern, is that you do unfortunately see these productivity declines in a lot of sockeye stocks that are from essentially pristine watersheds in the central and northern parts of BC and southeast Alaska. So if it were purely contaminants that were a driving factor, whatever they were, you would wonder why in pretty uncontaminated systems you would also be having those declines.
Within your recommendations, the problem I want to pose to you is we are probably living in a world of short governmental dollars. So I think there was evidence in the spring that there was an anticipated 5% budgetary cut across the board, including the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. So in that context, it would seem to me that if you were able to say, here's the top 3 projects, and if we could just do these top 3 projects, we would really come to a breakthrough in our understanding of the problems, that would be a nice position for us all to be in. But I take it from your table that you think that we're in a world where there's many different possible causes working in different combinations that differ from year to year, and that a comprehensive approach seems to be what you're recommending here.
I think you also have to recognize, when you start talking about future budget cuts, there's been a huge number of historical budget cuts. And so if you say to the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, well, we'd like you to be able to answer all these questions when things go wrong, but we're not going to actually give you any money to do it, I don't think that's a fair way of approaching it. So my approach to this, or our team's approach to this, was to say, here's what we think would be required to answer both management and scientific questions adequately. Now, if there aren't enough resources to do that, I think there needs to be a very careful consideration by a lot of people, as I outlined in what you see on page 107, as to what the trade-offs would be. And so I'm not going to throw out my best 3 guesses off the top of my head as to what would be the best, because I don't think that's the right way to make that decision. I think you have to really systematically analyze what are the benefits and costs of doing each of these things and of not doing them. What are the risks of not doing them?
In that context, I noted in your resume that you had some involvement with Carnation Creek research that has been done by Peter Czaplinski and others. Is that an example of a long-term project that has some messages about importance for understanding problems going forward?
Well, they're looking at effects of forest harvesting on salmon, and it's been a very valuable project with a long history. I think that there's always a compromise between a very intensive look at one watershed, like Carnation Creek, versus an extensive look at a bunch of watersheds, and I think you need both of those kinds of studies, because if you just look at one place, it's not going to be representative of all those places. So the 64 stocks that Peterman and Dorner looked at give us a very broad look, but not very deep, and whereas the work that say down on Carnation Creek or the Keogh River by Bruce Ward gives a much deeper look at a few places. You can't afford to do that everywhere, but I think you need both.
And in particular, you need long time series of data so it's important to keep it going year after year.
Absolutely.
I wanted to ask you briefly about work you've done for the province of British Columbia, that your firm has done for the province of British Columbia, to do with sensitive watersheds and a watershed evaluation tool. And can you just explain that to the Commissioner to the extent you're aware of it?
Sure. No, I've been involved in that work. And going back to the 90s, there was something called the Forest Practices Code, and every watershed that was scheduled for harvesting had to go through a watershed assessment procedure. And then around 2000, they decided that they didn't want to make forest companies do that for every single watershed. So they developed this watershed evaluation tool, which was basically a method of rating the relative sensitivity of different watersheds. And then those that had the most important fisheries or fish populations, and they could be either from a number of harvested fish or from a endangered species or species at risk point of view, or were most vulnerable because steep-sided watersheds and other geomorphic features made them more vulnerable to forestry, that those would be designated as fishery-sensitive watershed. And so the province has gone through and identified those. And then we've been working with the Ministry of Environment at a sampling design and a set of monitoring protocols that could be used both with remote sensing information as well as field protocols to try to assess the relative sensitivity and the current status of watersheds both before and after forest harvesting. And some of those methods are just being tested in the field actually next week.
Judging by the exhibit number of your resume, that you were probably a co-author on the technical report 3.
That's correct.
And so I, at a very high overview level, I recall that Catherine Witkowski did an approach to the wild salmon policy that it was sort of a shortcut tool. I know I'm grossly oversimplifying, and do you recall that?
Well, we have to get up technical report 3 if you actually want to look at it, but it's basically, she looked at a number of existing status assessments for the 36 conservation units. And while that work was ongoing, there was another report. I think the first was Pestel et al., and then there was another report by Grant et al. And so sort of compared the two and looked at how the two different status assessments turned out. And most of them didn't actually change very much. So I don't know what you mean by a shortcut. It was basically using the information that was available to provide some kind of status assessment for the 36 conservation units.
Have you been involved in work on the wild salmon policy apart from that report?
We have done some work. We did some work for Pacific Fisheries Resource Conservation Council on wild salmon policy, looking at, I think they call it other ecosystem values. So essentially, other animals that benefit from eating salmon and what the implications are of different escapement policies that way. We've also done work on wild salmon policy with Department of Fisheries and Oceans on the habitat side in terms of habitat indicators, and co-authored a document. I think Heather Stahlberg was the first author on that.
All right, and so strategy 4, as I understand it, is intended to deal with some form of integrated management. Have you, first of all, done any work or writing on that? Probably you may have done that on the PFRCC document.
No, we're not involved in strategy 4. I don't remember right now all the numbers in the wild salmon policy, but I think it was 2 and 3 rather than 4. One of my colleagues, Mark Nellitz, may have got involved in some of that work.
All right. The Commission Council this morning marked 3 documents, documents 1892, 93, 94, which were papers by Welsh and Parsons and Blackburn and Mackenzie and others. Are you familiar with those?
Just trying to remember which, these are
miscellaneous papers.
Are these the ones with pesticide use?
No. This is on sea surface temperatures.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, Welch and Parsons.
They weren't provided for this.
Oh.
Report.
All right.
They were from earlier parts of the hearings.
All right.
Sorry, no, I'm familiar with some of the work by David Welch, but I'm not familiar with the. Sorry, these ones that were marked this morning. No, this is the first time I've seen these.
All right. I have no further questions, Mr. Commissioner.
Good afternoon, Mr. Commissioner. Shane Hopkins-Utter, representing the BC Salmon Farmers Association this afternoon. And by my count, after Mr. Timberg took some of our time, I count that we have 20 minutes remaining. Dr. Marmorek, today I'm going to ask you some questions about modeling generally, and I think the first thing that I'd like to ask you about is the use of benchmarks. Mr. Lunn, if you could please pull up tab 2. This is Technical Report 1896 at PDF 29, page 13. The second paragraph beginning with rocket science.
Oh, I like this paragraph.
I do too, which is why I want to ask you about rocket science being used as a benchmark. Maybe you could just start us off with that, because I think after a very long time in hearings and being lawyers, we've come to appreciate the complexity of this, but I think your words will capture it best.
Well, I should mention that this particular paragraph had 2 completely opposite reactions to it. Randall Peterman asked if he could use it in an address to the American Fisheries Society, and Sean Cox said it was nonsense and should be removed. So given that range of benchmarks for this benchmark paragraph, the point here is that there is a lot of variability, particularly in the ocean, where it's not well monitored and the interactions can vary from year to year. So it's extremely difficult for fisheries scientists to predict what the recruits per spawner are going to be from a given parent generation. And so the metaphor here, and I think Sean Cox's objection was there's no place for metaphor in science writing, is that a rocket scientist would have to deal with continuing changes in the sort of ground conditions from year to year, and little ability to monitor that variation. But I don't know if it's really a benchmark in this context for science. I just think it means there's a lot of difficulty. I should mention that Sean Cox said in his review that fishery scientists were not smart enough to launch rockets. So that's the counter view here.
So in your opinion, would you prefer the weight of evidence leaning towards Peterman's assessment?
Understandably.
Moving on, well, given the complexity that you've just spoken of, I understand that models are generally used to be a type of representation of reality. Is that something that you would agree with, a mathematical representation of reality?
It's a simplification of reality for the purposes of answering some question of interest, and the famous saying is that all models are wrong and some are useful.
Well, you also noted earlier that the best model that you were able to come up with was, I think you used the word surprisingly, was the one that actually included the most factors, so the most real-world factors. Was that
Actually, no, that wasn't true. That was in one case. We went through several different analyses. That was true for the case where we were looking at combining or using all the Cohen Commission projects as the way of organizing information. When we organized it by life history stage, actually, models which use less information proved to be more informative.
You also mentioned that, I think it was in that same context, the AIC can penalize for having too many variables in it. Is that one of the weaknesses of the AIC?
No, it's not a weakness at all. It's a strength. Historically, biologists tended to throw all the things they've monitored into the computer, and they run 100 variables and 5 of them would come out significant, and they'd say, oh, these must be important. And that would happen just if you threw random numbers in. So the stress of the Burnham and Anderson approach, who promoted AIC in the 1990s, was to make very specific hypotheses and test only variables related to those hypotheses, and to, in fact, penalize models which threw more variables in but didn't get any better explanation of the data. So essentially you try to get the best possible explanation, in this case of sockeye productivity, with the least number of variables.
From my recollection, is that the R squared, you should be seeing some improvement as you go?
The AIC measure is a measure which includes the likelihood of the data given the models and a measure of how many variables you use. So that's different from the R squared that we talked about earlier.
Mr. Lund, if you could pull up tab 12. This is Spanos. I know I'm going to mispronounce it, so I'll just use the AIC. And the reliability of inference model selection versus statistical model specification, paper published in 2010. Are you, in fact, aware that there are criticisms of the AIC as evidenced in this paper?
Yes, and since we received those, which was 5 o'clock Friday, we actually had Carl Schwartz, head of statistics at Simon Fraser University, was the chair of the Simon Fraser Statistics Department, look over this paper, and we also looked it over.
Mr. Lund, could we mark that as the next exhibit?
Would you like me to comment on that paper?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Sorry. Just before I forget.
So the 2 points in the paper that Spanos raises here, the first is that AIC approaches give rise to unreliable inferences primarily because their choice within a prescribed family of models assumes away the problem of model validation, and secondly ignores relevant error probabilities.
So if those two faults are committed, then it will give rise to unreliable inferences? Is that what the paper is saying?
That's what the paper's saying, so I don't agree with it for a number of reasons. First of all, these AIC statistical methods have been used in the scientific literature over the last 15 and 20 years, and as described in Burnham and Anderson, 1998. And secondly, if you go through the process I described earlier, whereby you define your hypotheses based on biological theory and examine the relative level of support for each model using AIC and other criteria, goodness of fit measures of how well the model fits, examining residuals and doing other things, then it's quite valid approach to do. And we did that, we applied it appropriately. And I'll just say that while there are parts of that Spanos paper that Dr. Schwartz agreed with, there are other parts which he did not agree with at all.
Dr. Member, I hate to interrupt, but I do have limited time, unfortunately, and I was just wondering if you were in fact aware of the criticisms that some others make. You have stated on the record that you disagree with them, however.
Correct.
Mr. Commissioner, the witness was in the middle of an explanation. My friend put the article to him. The witness is allowed to explain whether he agrees with it or not agree with it. I mean, he wants to have this marked as an exhibit. He at least needs to allow the foundation to be met or not met.
I think the key point here is that if you carefully decide which hypotheses you're testing and then look at various diagnostic information, including AIC and other measures of goodness of fit, that they're wholly appropriate and that the criticisms outlined in this paper are not a problem.
Thank you for your answer. Sorry for trying to interrupt. Mr. Lunke, please take us to Exhibit 1896, Technical Report 6 at PDF 116.
SB 1905.
Again, Mr. Commissioner, the witness actually did not adopt anything or accept anything in this journal article, so I'm not sure that it should be marked as an exhibit.
Mr. Commissioner, I would suggest that, as has been the practice throughout these commission hearings, I've asked questions of the witness on the paper. He recognized it, he acknowledged that he had read it, and he gave his opinion on it.
Very well, mark it as an exhibit. Thank you.
Dr. Memrick, I note this table 4.8-1. It says other factors potentially contributing to the decline of Fraser River sockeye salmon that were not considered within the spectrum of Cohen Commission technical reports, and the list includes competition with pink salmon, hatchery fish, increased predation. So is it not true that there are a number of other factors that potentially contributed to the decline that just weren't being considered in the Commission reports?
Well, we mentioned one this morning of harmful algal blooms, and my sense is, I'd have to check, that virtually all of the other factors that were considered by the Pacific Salmon Commission workshop in June of 2010 are listed here. So in terms of primary factors that might be explaining the overall decline, I don't think there are any others. I welcome your suggestions.
I'm not the scientist, unfortunately. May we move to PDF 124, Mr. Lunn, of the same report. A little further down the page, actually at the bottom of the page, I believe. Thank you. So this is the cell downstream migration to estuary. It reads on the right-hand column, we do not know the survival rate of smolts during downstream migration or when they arrive in the Fraser estuary, which is, in parentheses, vital to understanding potential mismatches between arrival times and marine plankton blooms. And you give some recommended activities. Next page, Mr. Lund. At the top, under numbers 7 and 8. So is it true that the bold highlighting indicates what is a high priority in this table?
Those are the ones which we thought were, if you had to divide them roughly in half, those are the ones that we thought would be in the higher level priority. Others might disagree.
And number 8 reads estimates of the size and health of smolts arriving in the Fraser estuary, e.g. pathogens, contaminant body burdens, lipid reserves. That's not in bold text, is it?
It's not in bold text, but it's still there, which means it's still something we think is worth doing.
Mm-hmm. And are you aware that on August 24th, Dr. Miller, I'm going to paraphrase what she said, but Dr. Miller gave evidence that the signature, or sorry, the parvovirus may be coming from the freshwater environment due to the higher prevalence in smolts as they leave freshwater entering the marine environment. Would that testimony suggest that this number 8 here should be considered a higher priority?
I think it goes back to deciding, as I've said at least 2 or 3 times, what the decisions are you want to make and what are the most important inputs to those decisions, as I was just speaking to your colleague about the data quality objectives process. So the relative importance of genomic studies versus all these other things need to be examined in the context of what you're going to do with that information for what decisions.
Mr. Lund, page 66 of this report. I'm sorry, PDF 66, page 50. Under 4.3.1, the second sentence beginning with Nellis and al., 2011, point out that sockeye salmon smolts are cued to migrate towards the ocean in response to changing environmental conditions, which includes responding to day length, lake springtime temperatures. I'll skip down. Earlier outmigration could lead to a mismatch between the arrival of salmon smolts in the Fraser Estuary and Strait of Georgia and the timing of plankton blooms that are essential for growth and survival in stage 3, coastal migrations. Do you agree with this assessment that climate change can in fact affect the timing of salmon outmigration and availability of plankton blooms?
Yes, I do, and with the clarification that was mentioned earlier, that it could be that you arrive either too early or too late.
So one way or another, the smolts could be entering at a different time, and I guess the environment hasn't caught up at that point with their new timing?
Or the environment is changed in a different direction. Both could be changing in different directions for different reasons.
Mr. Lund, could you please take us to page 63, paper page 63 of this report? Second paragraph down. Dr. Memrick, would you agree that with the statement that you have here, second sentence, this suggests there is strong evidence for a direct impact of climate change on sockeye salmon?
So I think earlier I was asked about the overlap between changes in marine conditions and changes due to climate. And I think the key here is that climate change can and has increased sea temperatures and is likely to increase them more so, and that changes in sea temperatures affect prey, predators, competitors in various ways. So I think for here we're talking now about the coastal migration stage, which is why we concluded that this was a likely factor, both marine conditions and climate change.
Under conditions in Queen Charlotte Sound versus Strait of Georgia, I'm just going to note briefly, Peterman et al., that's the PSC report, Exhibit 73, concluded that it was very likely physical and biological ocean conditions inside Strait of Georgia during the life stage had been a major factor, and they rated this as likely in the contributing to poor ocean returns in 2009, and the Cohen Commission rated these similar conditions in the Strait of Georgia as being likely. Would you agree that this in fact confirms that both of those workshops concluded that it was either very likely or likely that the Strait of Georgia played a role in overall or 2009 returns?
I think that's what the workshop said, and then I think the work that was done subsequently in the reports was a lot more thorough in terms of the work by Dr. McKinnell at looking at the conditions actually within both the Strait of Georgia and Queen Charlotte Sound. And there's other work that's been already provided by Dr. Beamish, which provides further evidence. So I think we made a lot of progress iteratively amongst these different workshops, but also in the reports and articles.
So those environmental conditions then play what it seems to be, from my non-scientific background, a significant role.
Correct.
And isn't it also true that the top-ranked model that you discussed at the bottom of page 65 was in fact for the Strait of Georgia? The analysis of this time period showed, I'm reading 65, Mr. Line at the bottom, that there is support for both the Queen Charlotte Sound and Strait of Georgia models. The top-ranked model was for Strait of Georgia, the second for Queen Charlotte Sound, third was the global model, including both regions. So that is in fact true that the Strait of Georgia was the top-ranked model for this particular analysis.
Well, I think you have to put this model work in context, right? We took the data that was provided to us, and our main purpose, just as I said earlier, our main purpose was to see if we could disprove some of the hypotheses that came out of the Cohen Commission reports, particularly on marine conditions. So if it had turned out that marine conditions, for example, the variables that were in there had no support whatsoever in the productivity measures for sockeye, that would make us wonder, I wonder what's going on. So the fact that it came out that both the Strait of Georgia in one case and Queen Charlotte Sounds were good at, let's say, relatively good at predicting sockeye salmon productivity meant that we could not reject that hypothesis. It doesn't mean that these models are right. As I said earlier, all models are wrong, some are useful. This was useful in the sense that it allowed us to not throw away some of the conclusions that we'd already gleaned from the other Cohen Commission reports. It didn't contradict the conclusions we'd already came to by synthesizing the information in those reports.
And in my final minute, I would just like to ask something that that you just brought up. Why is it significant to attempt to disprove hypotheses rather than to prove theories?
I think that it's the basic approach of the scientific method, which is that as long as events occur in a way that is consistent with a theory, you can't reject it. But if an event then came along which was contradictory to that theory, you would then be able to reject it. So if you went along and said, well, the last 10 years, this seems to be correct, therefore it must be true, what would you do in year 11 when you found out you're wrong? So that's why it basically comes to the idea that you can only disprove hypotheses, and those which have failed to be disproven over a long period of time gradually become accepted.
Thank you very much, Mr. Commissioner. Those are my questions.
Greg McDade, I'm counsel for the Aquaculture Coalition. Doctor, you've probably had the most challenging job of the various report writers, as you had to put them all together.
By the way, I appreciate everyone calling me doctor, but it's really just Mr., so thought you might want to correct that.
I'm sorry.
Initials are DR. My parents strategically named me that way, but
Well, DR. I think it's you've noted quite clearly in your addendum report, and that's where I'm going to focus. I think that's Exhibit 1575. That the reports of Dr. Noakes and Dr. Dill were somewhat of an anomaly in this matter, in that they were fairly significantly different from each other. They came to opposing conclusions. I'm interested in how you attempted to resolve that matter. As I understand it from your report, you didn't really attempt to weigh those reports against each other or to choose who was right.
Mr. Lund, if we could go to the table 2 in page 18 and 19, I think that's informing this discussion. So we went through the decision tree, the retrospective ecological risk assessment tree, and admittedly neither Dill nor Noakes nor any of these authors had used that approach in organizing their reports, but we basically we mined those reports to say, well, where do they differ and where are they similar? And so if you look down the mechanism column, across waste, escapees, sea lice, disease, salmon origin, disease, those are the 4 really. They basically all agreed that there was a mechanism. Noakes did not agree that there was a plausible mechanism by which waste could affect sockeye salmon. When it came to exposure, they agreed that it was unlikely to be exposure to a significant fraction of sockeye salmon for either waste or escapees. They disagreed on sea lice, and they disagreed on disease. When it comes to correlation, consistency, they felt there was no correlation or consistency for waste, escapees, and sea lice. They all came out the same way, Noakes and Dill, but they disagreed on disease. So essentially, as you said, it wasn't our job to reconcile them. Our job was to look at what the implications would be if you used one report versus the other report for our overall conclusions. So where it comes down to is they came to unlikely conclusions by somewhat different pathways in our decision tree, but nevertheless the same conclusion, and with the 3 first rows there, but on the last row in disease came to different conclusions. So we basically just said, well, if you accept Dill, then this is what you would conclude, and if you accept Noakes, this is what we conclude.
Well, and I'm going to focus for the rest of my examination on the question of disease.
Okay.
And disease arising from fish farms. Now, if we go to page 14, top, sorry, one page earlier than that. Yes. So if we highlight the last half of the first paragraph there, Dill's examination of further evidence led him to believe that disease transfer from salmon farms is the most likely mechanism of concern that could explain the negative correlation between salmon farm production and sockeye productivity described by Connors. So we have Dr. Noakes saying one thing and Dr. Dill saying another. You don't evaluate who's more likely to be correct.
That's correct. We do recommend that we actually get some disease data.
Yes.
And actually, so did Noakes and Dill.
Because if but if Dr. Dill is right that disease transfer from salmon farms is the most likely explanation for the negative correlation between salmon farms and sockeye productivity, that may be the explanation for this long, or at least one major explanation for the long-term decline in productivity.
I don't think Dill said that salmon farm production was the most likely factor causing the decline in sockeye productivity. We'd have to go to his report, but I don't believe he ever said that it was most likely. I think what he said is that of the various mechanisms by which salmon farms might affect sockeye productivity, disease is the most likely causal pathway. That's quite a big difference.
Yes. And that's part of what the challenge we have before us is that in the absence of empirical evidence or empirical proof of these pathways, you're left with plausible hypotheses or plausible mechanisms, right?
Yes, that's correct.
And the difficult task that the commissioner faces here, I think it's fair to say that there's not a lot of empirical evidence about wild salmon catching disease, whether it's from salmon farms or any other source. That's something that you've identified as that lack of empirical evidence.
That's correct. We've identified it as a gap and as a need to be filled.
Right. And so if one hasn't done any studies on these questions, one's not going to find any empirical evidence.
By definition.
And as you also, I think, it's fair to say, it's very, very difficult to actually prove the cause of disease in a wild population of fish because the dead fish disappear before you can test them.
I haven't actually said that. I think that if you went, and as we say in the conclusions to this report, if you went out and measured the incidence of diseases in areas close to or far away from fish farms, or before and after sockeye pass fish farms, you would be able to get some useful information. The greater the level of contrast and exposure, the better. And just as a parenthetic addition to that, when the Okanagan First Nation was considering reintroducing sockeye into Skaha Lake, they went through 3 years of disease studies and had assistance from DFO and others, and measuring diseases in Columbia River sockeye versus diseases in fish in Skaha Lake. And they found out there really wasn't much difference. And so they proceeded with that experiment. So I think you can gather information on disease and make sensible decisions if you get the data.
So it's possible to design studies that would show these links if they're there.
I think so.
And that's not really rocket science, is it? That's a pretty obvious way to do it, isn't it?
It is good fishery science. Now, there are some wrinkles in that if you find a high incidence of disease in a population, and then you later find very low incidence of disease in the population, as Michael Kent said, that could be either because the disease disappeared or because the fish that had the disease died. So it's tricky, and I think it's useful to use some of these acoustic tagging information where it's possible to actually get a much better estimate of exposure.
If I accept that evidence that it's feasible to design studies that would tell us something about, on an empirical level about disease, the plain and simple fact is, to the best of your knowledge, nobody's done those studies.
To my knowledge, and also to Dr. Kent's knowledge in his report.
Did you run across any information to suggest why someone wouldn't have done such an obvious study over the 20 years that fish farms have been in place?
Well, I know there have been studies done on pink salmon, And I also know that it's been a challenge to get collaboration amongst the various groups to undertake such studies.
And so let me just wonder aloud about the wisdom, perhaps, of going looking for empirical evidence when no one's done the studies. That would be a pointless exercise, wouldn't it?
I think it's worth looking for whatever evidence exists and making the best judgments that you can given that evidence. And we were relying on Dr. Kent's summary of disease information to conclude that there wasn't much information and therefore that no conclusion was possible about disease. So we were assuming that he had scoured what was available.
Yes, and let's accept that as a given fact, that Dr. Kent is right, that no one's done any empirical studies, and so it's not possible to find those kinds of empirical proof. That's a reasonable statement, isn't it?
I think we're just repeating the same thing I just said, so.
Okay. Well, let me say this. In science, when you haven't done the studies that are necessary to establish the empirical connection, that doesn't mean the harm doesn't exist.
Oh, that's correct. Something could be happening that is not good for you or for the fish, and you haven't done the study to detect it, yes?
Well, in science, there's a body of science that talks about risk or likelihood of something existing that isn't based on direct empirical evidence. That's common in science, that you have evidentiary studies, but you also have theoretical studies.
There are theoretical studies, but in the absence of evidence, there are many possible theories as to what's going on. I've seen many examples over my career where people argued vociferously over some particular parameter or mortality rate, and when they actually got the data, there wasn't much to talk about anymore. So I think the simple answer is go out and get the data. Because otherwise, there's a very wide range, just as we see here between Dill and Noakes' conclusions. In the absence of information, and all there really was Connor's estimate of total farm production, and Noakes questions the degree to which that represents diseases. It's a very indirect indicator. It's still the only indicator that he had that was available to him. So I think the answer is to get the information.
If there's no empirical evidence one way or the other, it would certainly be wrong to say that diseases coming from fish farms are not the cause of the 2009 sockeye decline. Simply have no proof of that at all, do you?
Okay, so now you've asked a question with respect to 1 year's poor returns, namely 2009, and asking the question, if you don't have any empirical evidence, are you able to reject salmon farms as a cause of that decline? So I would argue that based on the fact that the difference between 2009 returns and 2010 returns was something like a 14 or 15-fold change in recruits per spawner, that it's pretty unlikely that there was a 14 or 15-fold change in the amount of disease occurring between the 2009 returns and the 2010 returns. In other words, I would say it's pretty unlikely that the main cause of the variation between those 2 years was due to salmon farms. It's much more likely, as we said in our report, that it was due to marine conditions, specifically temperatures and lack of circulation and the like. This is not to say that salmon farms have had no effect. As we've said several times today, things which are not the primary factors responsible could still be contributing factors.
When one talks about cumulative impact, which is the title of your paper, if disease combined with bad ocean conditions causes mortality, that would be a direct effect, wouldn't it? Be a cumulative effect.
It's possible that disease and marine factors could combine. As for when we talked about disease earlier and we said, well, because we have no data, no conclusion is possible, I think you still need to come back to that and say, in the absence of actually having data on the exposure of sockeye to that stress, you're not able to draw a conclusion as to its relative likelihood of being a primary factor.
Doesn't disease, by its nature, when it becomes epidemic, isn't it episodic?
Well, it can be. There are some other diseases which enter into populations and stay in those populations for long periods of time. They don't necessarily always go up and down.
Yes, but it's not uncommon. The disease can have a very significant effect in a given year and then not so much in the year before and the year after.
That can happen.
Yes.
I agree.
So you can't really draw those conclusions even from 2009 and 2010, can you?
So your argument, as I take it, is that in the absence of any disease information, but based on the fact that some diseases go up and down, that diseases could be responsible for the 15-fold fluctuation in recruits per spawner between 2009 returns and 2010 returns. I guess in the absence of any information which show one way or the other that there were massive outbreaks of diseases, you couldn't reject that. It seems unlikely, though, in that you would think that if there were massive outbreaks of diseases, you would have heard something about it from the fish farmers, and you would have seen something about it in the database that has been collected, admittedly, only for a very short period of time. So I think looking at that data, which showed basically no trends in diseases, the work that the database that Josh Corman put together, I think it becomes a bit of a stretch to say that how likely it was that there was a sudden big disease that nobody detected.
Did you read the cross-examination of the Project 5 and Project 1 reports?
Parts of it. It's pretty long. I didn't read all of it.
Were you aware that there were diseases found in that database that 60% of the time were identified as unknown or open?
Yes, I read that portion.
That's a pretty significant fact, isn't it?
Again, we're talking, yeah, I believe that, I think it was something like it went from 2% to 5% in the total number of fish, or something like that, wasn't it? So,
the question is,
it seems a fairly small proportion to me, and it doesn't mean to say, I don't think you can say anything about the amount of disease that existed prior to them monitoring for disease in fish farms. So prior to 2002, we don't have a very good estimate, and I think that Brendan Connors did the best he could to use the salmon farm production as a proxy indicator, if you will, for disease.
So let me ask you this: in the debate between Dr. Noakes and Dr. Noakes' criticisms of Dr. Connors' methodology, you're familiar with that. Yeah. Where do you stand on that? Was Dr. Connors right or wrong?
Truth is somewhere in between. Some of the points that Noakes made, this is Exhibit 1538, which I looked at last week, was farm production used by Connors is not an adequate proxy variable for disease. And I agree that it would be much better if there were farm-specific levels of production and a much longer time series of disease, and also that you didn't have to aggregate the data for proprietary reasons. So I think it would be much better if there were more detailed information, but historical data doesn't exist. I think it was reasonable to use that as a proxy measure, just like sea surface temperature is a proxy measure for a bunch of other things, food production. Some of the other criticisms, IHN was not detected prior to 2003. Well, we don't actually have good disease data prior to 2003. If we did, we'd use it. BKD was more of a problem for Pacific than Atlantic salmon. Well, Pacific salmon were mostly used before in the earlier time periods, so it's not unreasonable to assume a proportionality between production and disease if there were disease. We don't know that there were disease, but it's not an unreasonable proxy indicator. And then I think there were some other criticisms. We said pink salmon may influence Fraser River sockeye salmon, although there is no strong evidence to support this assumption. Actually, there is in the PSC report. Appendix C E16, Greg Ruggieri's analysis is quite strong, correlative evidence of pink salmon effects on Fraser sockeye. Noakes said that Connors did not account for density dependence because he didn't use residuals from the stock recruitment curves, but he didn't use the residuals, but he included spawners, so he does, and all his models included density dependent effects. So all in all, I didn't think the criticisms from Noakes about Connors' work were sustainable. I think there are certainly weaknesses in the historical data set, and it would be much better if there had been per farm production data and actual disease data going back all the way back to the 1980s, but it didn't exist.
But there's nothing wrong with Dr. Connors' methodology given the data he had to work with.
I didn't see anything wrong. I thought he was quite careful in the way he went through his work.
There is a body of literature that's been introduced, some of it which has been introduced as exhibits into this commission, which established that aquaculture facilities are, in theory, an ideal place for disease to generate and emerge. You're familiar with that body of literature?
I haven't seen this paper before. I have heard about those ideas. I'm not as familiar with the literature as either Dr. Noakes or Dr. Dill are.
Well, as you point out, Dr. Noakes didn't really look to this body of literature, and Dr. Dill did.
What we pointed out was that there were only 25 references amongst the 250 that they had in common, and we also recommended that some independent scientists actually work on reviewing all this literature.
Well, in the absence of empirical evidence, because the studies just haven't been done, if you have evidence from other places, and you have theoretical evidence and plausible hypothesis that on a biological level, fish farms are likely to be ideal breeding grounds for disease, shouldn't that be relevant in assessing the risk? Isn't Dr. Dill right to refer to that kind of literature?
I think it's reasonable to look at that other literature in terms of assessing the risk, in terms of evaluating how large that risk is. As I said earlier, until you have data, the range of tenable hypotheses is really large. So I don't think it's that difficult to collect that data, and therefore, rather than making inferences entirely based on evidence from other places, I think it would make sense to actually get the data.
But in the meantime, until you've done some empirical studies, if you have scientific evidence that a particular activity is potentially harmful, how do you take that into account in terms of whether, for instance, whether to cite fish farms in the middle of wild salmon migration routes? How does one evaluate risk in the absence of empirical evidence?
Well, I think that you try to use information on past locations of, in this case, fish farms, and observe what has happened to animals moving past them. You try to gather all the information that you can and make your best judgment. And I think that, some of that's what the Cohen Commission is doing overall here, is trying to make their best judgment based on incomplete information on a number of factors, including fish farms.
So, to use a metaphor, if you have an explosives factory that hasn't blown up for 3 or 4 years, but creates a risk, does it make sense to site it in downtown? Or would you send your children to a school next to an explosives factory? Isn't risk a factor to be considered, even though you lack empirical evidence? And isn't that what Dr. Dill was doing?
Well, I think there's pretty strong empirical evidence that explosives explode. And I don't think there's quite as strong empirical evidence
that fish farms cause disease?
That fish farms have caused disease in sockeye salmon. And so I think it's reasonable to combine what evidence you have and make your best judgments, just as Dr. Dill did, and just as Dr. Noakes did as well. They made different judgments. I think that's, based on the evidence that they looked at. I think it would be valuable to have other independent scientists look at it. I still would argue that, if it took you 10 years to get this information, okay, maybe you make a judgment now, but if it takes you 1 year to get the information, why not just go out and do it?
Just let me change gears for a second, because I was struck by the logical wisdom of what you said when you said it makes sense to look for the bottlenecks in terms of the life history stage, and then look for the stressors within that particular bottleneck. Now, if we were to apply that approach here, am I correct in hearing you that one bottleneck you had identified is the early marine stage, or the coastal migration stage, in terms of the life history stage?
Yes.
And when one looks at that bottleneck and the stressors that are new in the environment since this long-term productivity decline in 1992, I hear your report talking about climate change or marine conditions as one stressor that may have changed. Are there any others that shout out at you on the coastal migration phase?
Well, clearly, fish farms are one candidate stressor, and they were included in our conceptual model. I wonder if I could quickly get, Mr. Lunn, if you go to page 34 in our report, just as by way of answering this question, I think it's really important, as I said at the beginning, to think about the overall pattern that it is we're trying to explain. And it's not only the pattern of decline in the Fraser stocks. These are non-Fraser stocks. Now they've also, if you look at the Southeast Alaska stocks, and you look at the Yakutat stocks, and you look at the Central Coast stocks, which have very minimal exposure to fish farms, they've also shown declines. So this isn't to say that fish farms could not have affected Fraser River stocks, but I don't think they're sufficient. I don't think fish farms are a sufficient explanation for the pattern of decline in sockeye generally between Washington and Southeast Alaska.
So the fact that the Okanagan and Columbia stocks did well in 2009 when the stocks that migrated up the Inside Passage, that would be a relevant fact to you too, wouldn't it?
Yes, and the work that Kim Hyatt's done shows that there were very different temperature conditions on the outer side of the west coast of Vancouver Island, where those stocks were going, than occurred in the Strait of Georgia in 2007, which was their migration year for those smolts. So what I'm pointing to is it's not just fish farms that differ between the inside and the outside. There's also many other oceanographic variables that can differ.
Can we go to page 23 of the addendum report, 1575? Just want to numbered page 23. Yes, thank you. You've made two pretty strong recommendations as I see it here. In the third line below the bold headings, you say that there are three categories of high priority data which need to be incorporated into the database. One is fish health in farm salmon, two is water quality in the vicinity of salmon, and three is wild sockeye post-smolt survival estimates before and after passing salmon farms. Now, I think we've discussed that already.
Yes, I think so, yeah.
Yeah, and these you describe as high priority because they're potentially significant if the answers are positive.
I think it's necessary to get data to test alternative hypotheses.
And further down the page, you acknowledge the recommendation of Drs. McAllister and Carruthers that one idea would be to experimentally manipulate the intensity of salmon farming by having fallow years and seeing what the outcome would be. Now that seems to make sense. Do you think that's appropriate to the risk?
I think that creating as strong contrasts as possible in both space and time has been shown in many other environmental stressors to be the best way of trying to find a signal. Now, that having been said, I just add one additional thing, is you should do it in a way that doesn't get confounded with pink salmon. So if you did it every odd year, foul it every odd year, that would really screw up your experimental designs. You might want to do it 1 out of every 3 years or something like that. Get it out of sync. So you basically want to separate the signal from the noise.
Can we have exhibit 1573 on
73?
1573?
Okay.
Now, there's one place, 1563, I'm sorry.
Thanks.
That didn't look at all. There's one place on the coast where the salmon migration migrates to a very narrow place and where there's a great number of fish farms. That would that be the most sensible place to do that experiment?
I haven't really thought about it before. I think if you could create contrast between the highest level of exposure and the least, that would be the most informative. So I'm not sure in this diagram whether the salmon going along Johnstone Strait would be less exposed than the salmon which are going inland through some of those areas where you've got lots of pink dots. But I think you'd have to think about that and try to get as much contrast and exposure as possible so you could test the hypothesis.
Well, in 2007, the Chinooks, those farms that were growing Chinooks in that area were removed and weren't present in 2008. Don't we in fact have the fallowing experiment? If that's true, that's the nature of the fallowing experiment you might do. And we might see what the difference is in returns in 2009 and 2010.
Oh, I don't think you'd want to look at returns because then you're integrating all sorts of other information. What I would suggest is that you'd want to look at acoustically tagged fish so you can tell exactly where they went and what exposures they had, and then look at diseases in co-migrating fish. Maybe you can't look at the disease without sacrificing the fish beforehand, but I think you want to look at disease and health of those fish. Returns have every other factor influencing them as well, so I don't think it would be a very good test to just look at returns.
Thank you. That's my time, Mr. Moore.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Quinn.
Take a break.
Hearing will now recess for 10 minutes.